Welcome, history lovers, to this edition of the History of Christianity Season 2. Today we continue looking at the events that occurred at the early part of the Protestant Reformation, and as such, those events heavily involved Martin Luther. And there certainly was a great deal of resistance to Luther's thinking. Luther's 95 Theses was printed and distributed throughout Germany in both Latin and German. That's important because it meant that not just the educated people could read it, but those that were the common people that could read German. They didn't have to have a knowledge of Latin, so that meant a lot more people read it. Luther sent a copy to Albert of Brandenburg, who sent it on to Pope Leo X with a request to intervene. Emperor Maximilian was enraged at Luther, and he also asked Leo to intervene. So you've got two pretty powerful guys who are making the Pope aware of what's going on, and they have asked, both of them have asked Leo to do something about this, and of course he's going to have to act in some way. In the meantime, Luther published a detailed explanation of the Theses, adding clarity but also sharpening his attack on indulgences. And this is the point of contention between Luther and a lot of the powerful people. The sale of indulgences was a big money maker. They saw Luther as being somebody that was getting in the way of their money train. He was keeping them from being able to go in and bilk people. And they didn't like that, of course. Luther was going to get in the way of all of their big plans. And so they were going to be down on Luther regardless of whether or not they thought what he was saying was really heretical or not. It didn't matter. He was attacking the money, and that's just not going to stand. So Luther made a lot of enemies right off the bat, and he didn't do himself any favors by continuing that line of attack, but he was standing up for what he knew to be correct. Leo's response was to ask the Augustinian order, of which Luther was a member, to deal with him. Leo doesn't intervene directly himself right away. He decides that this order can take care of this. He doesn't have to step in, and they can take care of things, and that'll be plenty. That'll be enough. And this was a big tactical error. Luther was called to the order's next meeting in Heidelberg. Luther went, fearing that he would be condemned and burned as a heretic. That's not what happened. Instead, he found that many of his fellow friars approved of his teaching. Some of the younger ones were very enthusiastic about it. Remember that at this time, Luther's not the first guy to come along saying there needs to be reform. There have been reform movements for years now, and it's definitely something that people all around are interested in, particularly those that are in the lower levels of leadership in the church and then the common people. So Luther is giving them what they want to see, and they're aware also that the Reformation doesn't just need to happen as it has to do with corruption within the church, although there's plenty of that, but also in theology. They know that the church is not correct in what it's been teaching. So what Luther has presented to them is checking a lot of the boxes that they've seen as being issues. And not only does Luther arrive at this place and is not burned as a heretic, he is gaining followers as a result of this. And that is not what Leo intended. This was a big mistake on his part. If he had stepped in directly to deal with it early on, maybe things would have gone a little bit differently, but he didn't do that, and Luther is picking up steam. Luther returned to Wittenberg, strengthened by the support of his order, and encouraged by those he was able to win over to his cause. So a runaway freight train is just gathering steam. It's getting more momentum behind it. And those that are in the power to maybe put a stop to it have not acted soon enough, and things are about to break wide open. Of course, there is going to be an attempt to try to stop it first. Pope Leo next sent Cardinal Cajetan to the imperial diet, the assembly of the princes and nobles meeting in Augsburg. Emperor Maximilian presided over the diet. Leo again sent somebody to represent him to try to answer about what's going on with Luther. During the meeting, Cajetan was to meet with Luther and force him to recant. If Luther refused, he was to be sent as a prisoner to Rome. So the Pope's taking things more seriously now, and basically the answer to this is either you say what you've been saying is wrong, or you're coming back to Rome in chains. However, Luther's ruling prince, Frederick the Wise, secured a safe conduct for Luther from Emperor Maximilian. Now, you're probably thinking what I'm thinking if you have followed the history of what's been going on in the church for a number of years now. These safe conduct promises are about like the vote of confidence when it comes to a coach in football or something like that. They're not worth anything. As a matter of fact, if you have one, that probably means you're in trouble, because the fact that you needed it in the first place is not a good sign. And the fact that nobody is going to honor it when it comes right down to it is an even worse sign. So, you think, well, that's great. I've got this safe conduct, but it's not worth the paper it's written on. Luther had no faith in the emperor's word. He knew his history, but he went anyway, believing he would not die unless God willed it. Luther knew right off the bat, he had no preconceived notions. He knew that the safe conduct didn't mean nothing. If they wanted to arrest him, they would arrest him. If they wanted to burn him at the stake, they'd burn him at the stake. If they wanted to take him prisoner to Rome, they'd do that. But he went anyway, believing that God was going to take care of him. And so he acted in faith. The meeting did not go well. Cajetan refused to discuss Luther's teachings and demanded he recant. Luther agreed to withdraw what he had said, providing he could be convinced he was wrong. And Cajetan was not going to even discuss that with him. That's not what he was there for. He was there for one of two things: either recant or I'm taking you prisoner. Unable to reason with Cajetan and fearing arrest, Luther secretly left at night and returned to Wittenberg. Once there, he appealed to a general council. Luther could tell that this was not going well. He could tell he wasn't going to be listened to, and he knew that the next step in this process was him being arrested. So he got out of there. And early on in this whole thing, Luther owes his success and owes him staying out of prison and possibly killed to this guy, Frederick the Wise. Throughout this time, Luther enjoyed the protection of Frederick the Wise, Elector of Saxony. Frederick's protection was based on his sense of justice. Luther deserved a hearing and a fair trial. Frederick didn't necessarily agree with Luther. He didn't even agree that he wasn't a heretic. Frederick would have said he very well might be. What Frederick rejected and what he objected to was that Luther just be thrown to the wolves without having an opportunity to explain himself or be heard. And Frederick wanted to be remembered as a fair ruler, as somebody that was a wise person and that would listen to what his subjects had to say. And so he wasn't going to allow that to happen. And again, he is a big reason why Luther was able to continue on in this movement, whereas if it had been somebody else, he probably would not have been. Frederick had also founded the University of Wittenberg, where many professors supported Luther. So he was listening to these guys. This was his university. He knew who all of the professors were. He knew the high up leadership. And they're telling him, you need to hold off. This guy is not just a heretic. You need to listen to him. This is a guy that is convincing a lot of people that what he has to say is right. So you keep on supporting him. Though opposition to Luther was mounting, Frederick stood firm. So he had the support. Then Maximilian died. So the emperor dies. And that leaves the imperial throne vacant. A new emperor needed to be elected. So anytime in history there is a power vacuum, that's going to bring in a lot of factors into play. Things change quickly when that happens, and the events of the future that you thought you might be able to predict all of a sudden become unpredictable because there's a big change in leadership, and that's about to happen here. The leading candidates, Charles I of Spain and Francis I of France, posed a threat to the Pope due to the amount of power and territory they already possessed. These leaders were not opposed to the Pope. They weren't opposed to the church necessarily, especially Charles I of Spain. He was very devout in his faith, and he supported the Catholic Church. But they both of these guys had a lot of power. And remember, at this point in history, the Catholic Church is not just interested in religious power, it's interested in political power. And the church has been instrumental in naming emperors, naming leaders of countries. They're not content to just sit back and be the religious wing. They want to say in everything. And so anybody that might come in and have a strong hold on more power and therefore weakening the voice of the church when it comes to the political events of the day, that was going to be a threat. And Pope Leo was way more concerned with that than he was about Luther. So even though one of these guys might have been more helpful to him when dealing with Luther, they weren't going to be more helpful to him in what he really cared about, which was consolidating power and keeping it in with the Pope. And so he rejected these two guys. Therefore, Pope Leo, despite his opposition to Luther, favored Frederick for the new emperor. Now, isn't this interesting? The guy that is protecting Martin Luther is now the guy that Leo has to wine and dine and try to support to be the new emperor, because he feels like he can have more political sway if he's got Frederick in charge than he would if Charles or Francis were in charge. So just a very interesting turn of events in history that started with Maximilian dying and continued to change events because of the fact that Frederick was not going to allow anything bad to happen to Luther without him being heard. So all of a sudden, the Pope can't come down hard on Luther right now. He knows that he's got to curry favor with Frederick and be in support of him, and Frederick is supporting Luther, so things have changed. As a show of support, Leo postponed the condemnation of Luther and sought better relations with him and Frederick. Leo sent Karl von Miltitz as his ambassador to Frederick. Karl was instructed to approach Luther in a conciliatory manner. So, wow, things have changed. Cajetan was coming in to arrest Luther and throw him back to Rome in chains. Now, the next guy that's coming to him, old Karl, he's coming out with the olive branch. He's coming out to try to make friends with Luther and try to see some middle ground. So all of a sudden, Luther's in a way different position, a way better position. Miltitz met with Luther. Luther promised to avoid further controversy as long as his opponents did the same. So this is kind of a ceasefire. I'm not gonna go back on what I've said, but I'm not gonna make it any worse right now, and you have to promise to do the same thing, and they did. But that wasn't gonna last either. Along comes this guy, John Eck, to throw his weight around. The truce didn't last long. John Eck, a professor of the University of Ingolstadt, was furious at Luther and his teachings. So Professor Eck is not having this with Luther. He wants to intervene. In order to appear to maintain the existing peace, Eck attacked Andreas Rudolf Bodenstein von Karlstadt. That is a mouthful of a name. Another professor at Wittenberg. So what Eck decides to do is, I'm not going to attack Luther directly, but I'm going to attack one of the main proponents of what Luther is saying, and therefore indirectly I'll be attacking Luther's position. I just won't attack the man directly. Karlstadt had been persuaded to Luther's position so much so that he was ready to carry his new beliefs to their radical conclusions. So he was even more Lutheran than Luther was at this point. Eck challenged Karlstadt to a debate. Luther knew that this was indirectly an attack on him, as the question posed for the debate were those raised by Luther. Now, Luther's not stupid. He knows what's going on. And he's also not the type of guy that's going to just sit back and let that happen. So Luther decided that he too would participate in the debate. He's going to get directly involved. The debate lasted several days. When Eck and Luther finally confronted each other, it became clear that Luther had a better knowledge of Scripture, while Eck was stronger in canon law and medieval theology. So Luther's going to be far and away the guy that's going to be strong in the Scriptures, but Eck has a trick up his sleeve. He knows canon law, the law of the church, and he knows this medieval theology, which is the theology of the day. So he's going to have some weight to throw around himself. He's going to be able to stand toe to toe with Luther on that basis. Eck led Luther to take a stance supporting John Huss, who had been unjustly condemned a heretic and burned at the stake. If you don't remember about Huss, we talked about him last season, so you can go back and I don't remember exactly which episode, but you can look him up. He was one of the early guys that tried to bring some reformation in not just the corruption, but also theology. And for his efforts, he got burned at the stake. And Luther had to support him because he would have been taking the same position that Luther did, and Luther couldn't condemn that. By declaring himself in agreement with a heretic who had been condemned by an ecumenical council, Luther lost the debate. Eck had proven what he had set out to prove, that Luther was a heretic and a supporter of the teachings of Huss. So Eck went in there doing it. He knew exactly what he was going to do. He knew the trap he was going to set, and he was going to paint Luther and his ideas in a bad light, not by actually attacking the ideas themselves, but by just putting him in the category with the guy that the church had already said was a heretic, and he had been burned at the stake because of it. And by that basis alone, Eck was able to say, well, you know what? If Luther supports a heretic, then that means Luther's a heretic too. And so he came in and he did exactly what he came to do. He painted Luther in the light of being in support of a known heretic, and therefore he would, by his own admission, be a heretic himself. But obviously that wasn't the end of the story. This began a new stage in Luther's attempt to reform the church. Luther began to face more open confrontation and greater dangers. He also found more support. During the time of truce, Luther and his followers gained more support throughout Germany. So one of the things that's happening while the Pope's kind of backed off of Luther, he's not directly attacking him. There's some other things going on, X involved, but Luther's still kind of free to do the things he wants to do. Well, that means that grassroots effort of his supporters and his teachings getting out there to the common people, that's going on, and there's not any stop being put to it. There's nobody opposing it right now because they can't. And so he is consolidating support throughout Germany, which is going to be a big factor going forward. Many saw him as the champion of biblical faith. They realized there were problems with what the church had been teaching. They realized that there were even problems in the reading of Scripture and the way it had been interpreted and the sources of the original documents that they had, the original language that they were using that were not the best. And now Luther's coming along, and he's standing up against some of the problems they had seen, and he's being painted now as this is the guy that is going to restore the correct biblical teaching to the church. Luther added support from many humanists and German nationalists. These are two groups that would have been on Luther's side for different reasons. The humanists wanted reform. Remember, they were the ones who they were interested in the classic literature, so they had gone back and read some of the early Christian manuscripts that were now starting to get into Western Europe, and they realized there's some problems in the church. There's some problems in the theology and the teachings of the church because they're not matching up with what we have from what was being said by the early church leaders. So they were going to be in support of Luther. They weren't necessarily that big in support of breaking the church up or breaking off from the church, although some of them would have been okay with it. But they definitely were for reform. The German nationalists, they didn't necessarily care about the religious part of it, but they liked that somebody was standing up for the German people against the church. The Germans at this time are very nationalistic. They feel that the church has taken advantage of them through the years and kind of used them as a money tree. Just come in and pluck money from them whenever they need it, and they really weren't doing anything to help the German people. They just had them around to suck them dry for their money when they needed it. And so they're not in favor of the church, not necessarily because of theology, but because of the way they've been treated. So they look at Luther as being the man who's standing up for the German people. So he's got support. And the humanists did see several points of agreement between Luther's protest and the Reformation they had planned. So they definitely saw a kindred spirit there. And again, the German nationalists saw in Luther the mouthpiece of German outrage against perceived abuses of Rome. So some condemnations coming for Luther next. Despite the plans of the Pope, Charles I of Spain was elected emperor. So Frederick didn't make it in. This guy Charles I does. He takes the name Charles V. The bad thing for the Pope is this emperor is going to have a lot of say because he's got a lot of power. The good thing for the Pope is he is a staunch supporter of the church, and he doesn't want anything going on with heresy whatsoever. Charles I was strictly Orthodox and refused to support what he considered to be heresy. His election bode ill for Luther, so this is not a good term for Luther at all. Despite Frederick's continued support of Luther, Pope Leo formally condemned Luther in the papal bull Exsurge Domine. So the Pope now, he can't prop Frederick up anymore as being a guy that's going to be the new emperor that he can kind of control behind the scenes. So he doesn't have to be on Frederick's side when it comes to Luther anymore. So now the Pope's coming in and he's condemning Luther. He's getting directly involved now. He's no more sending anybody else in. And he flat out condemns Luther altogether. In it, Leo ordered all books by Luther be burned. Luther was given 60 days to submit to Roman authority or suffer excommunication. So this is a big deal. Burn all his materials, and then you come around or we're kicking you out. As the bull traveled to Luther, copies of it arrived in various German territories. In some, the charge to burn Luther's works was obeyed. So some of the places that read it said, okay, We're going to support the church and the Pope. We'll burn Luther's works. But in other places, his opponents' works were burned instead. They took Luther's side. They said, no way we're burning his stuff. In fact, you want us to burn something? Okay, we'll burn something. We'll burn the books of the people that have stood out against Luther. And so there was book burning going on all over the place, some in support of Luther and some in opposition to Luther. When the papal bull finally made its way to Luther, he did what I guess they did it that day. They burned it. He burned it publicly. So I guess that was the thing to do. They were in favor of burning books, and Luther said, well, you want to burn my stuff? Let me just go ahead and burn your stuff. So he burned it. And not only that, it was also along with other works he found to be the worst examples of popish doctrines. So Luther is giving eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, burning for burning. If you want to burn my stuff, I'll burn your stuff. And so now, formally, officially, Luther's been condemned by the church. It's been ordered for those in the church to burn his works, and he has 60 days to come around, or else he's done for. The breach was final, with no way to undo it. So if there was ever, in any period of this conflict, if there was ever a point that there could have been reconciliation, if there could have been common ground, if there could have been some, okay, you know what, you make some good points, let's get together and talk about this. All that was gone now. There was no way to come back from this. And so the split has occurred, and it's not going to come back. Now, you say there's no way to come back. Could there have ever been a way to come back? Maybe. But it wasn't realistic, it wasn't likely, and it certainly did not happen. The split has happened now. Condemnation has been met by equal condemnation from the other side, and reconciliation is not going to happen. That leads us to the Diet of Worms. Pope Leo needed the emperor and other German lords to support his silence of Luther. So Pope Leo knows that he's let this thing get out of hand, and it's not going to be enough for him just to condemn Luther. Luther has a lot of support now, and he needs to get some powerful people to come and jump on alongside him. So he's going to appeal to them. Yet even the devout Emperor Charles V used Luther as a political tool against the Pope. So it's why the church doesn't need to be in politics, and the politics don't need to be in the church. It's going to do nothing but cause problems, and it's not going to lead to any honesty in the way of doing things. There is stuff going on behind the scenes all the way through this. You saw it yourself with the Pope that was against Luther, all of a sudden had to be in support of him because he wanted Frederick in charge, and then when that doesn't happen, he's against him again. Charles is against him, but he finds that he can use Luther to control the Pope, so he uses him as a tool. It's just a bunch of nonsense. It's just a bunch of junk. But that's what was happening in the day, so the Pope's not getting the cooperation even from Charles that he thought he was going to get. It was decided that Luther would appear before the Imperial Diet at Worms in 1521. So we're going to have another one of these meetings, and let's get old Luther in here. He wants to be heard. Let's give him a chance to be heard. There, Luther was taken before the emperor and several of the lords of the German Empire. So he's in front of the big wigs now. He's not playing in the little leagues anymore. He's in the big show. Luther was shown several books and asked if he had written them, to which he answered that he had. There's no getting around that. He wrote them. He was then asked if he wished to recant anything he had written. Luther asked for a day's time to consider his answer. Understand this, Luther didn't take it lightly that he was standing up against the church. Luther didn't take it lightly that he was standing up against the emperor, because in the view of the people of this day, and somewhat a biblical view as well, God appointed the leadership. He appointed the Pope. He appointed the king. There wouldn't be a leader there if God didn't let him be there. So even the worst leader, he was still God's man. He's still the man God put in that position. And Luther is now having to oppose both of them. The God-given leadership that Luther feels like is the opposition to him. And if he is to come out and say, I don't recant, I stand by every word I've said, he knows he is directly opposing the church, the Pope, and the emperor. And Luther, for all of his faults, he didn't take it lightly. and he wanted time to think about it. He really was conflicted about how to go about answering this so that he didn't face condemnation from God in what he did. So he was given that time. He didn't take the opposition lightly. Again, he knew both had been ordained by God. The next day, the meeting hall was filled. People wanted to know, what's he going to do? What's he going to say? Luther was asked, here's the big question. Luther was asked if he would recant. He agreed that he would. Same answer he gave at the last one, if he could be shown any error he had made. So he said, absolutely, I'll recant. All I need is you just to show me where I'm wrong. Show me where I've made a mistake, and I will, no questions asked, I'll recant immediately for that. That wasn't the answer they wanted to hear. They were not there to debate Luther. They were not there to go over his material and show him where he was wrong. They were not there to come up with any middle ground. They weren't there for any of that. They weren't there to give any explanations to Luther. They were there for Luther to say, I was wrong and I recant. And that's it. And that's what he got asked. After he said that, they just said, okay, you didn't hear my question. Do you recant or do you not? This is it. This is the moment. There's no going back. Luther has a tough decision to make. He can't even get them to show him where they feel like he's wrong. It's an all or nothing deal. You either believe what you say you believe, or you turn your back on it. And that was the position Luther was put in. And because of that, he only had one answer he could give. Luther replied, my conscience is a prisoner of God's word. I cannot and will not recant, for to disobey one's conscience is neither just nor safe. God help me. Amen. Upon this declaration, he left the hall. It's kind of a drop the mic moment. Luther just flat out said, if that's where you're painting me into the corner, if that's the decision I have to make, if it's an all or nothing deal, then I can't do it. God's word supersedes these earthly authorities, and I can't go against that. My conscience won't allow me. And he even said, God help me. This was not easy for him. He didn't want this, but he has it now. Like it or not, here we are. Luther had now challenged Rome and the empire. He had ample reason to plead, God help me. And he's going to need God's help because he's got some powerful people against him. And any other time in church history from this point back to when the emperor got involved with Constantine, Luther would not have stood a chance. There was no way a human being, a common, even a person in church leadership, but lower in the ranks, there was no way they were going to be able to stand up against both the Pope of the church, the overall leader of the church, acknowledged by everyone, and the emperor himself. But Luther came at just the right time. And he was in just the right circumstances to be able to do it. And of course, we know in history that he did. So this is the point that we're going to stop with this now. We'll continue on next week by looking at what happens next for Luther. He's an outlaw. He's not, nobody likes him that's in charge. And he doesn't get to just keep on doing things the way he wants to. He's on the run. He's having to go into hiding. So Luther is going to do that. But of course, political and religious circumstances change with the wind. And so things are going to be coming along that's going to both make it harder for Luther and also make him able to do what he ended up doing by bringing about the Protestant Reformation, being one of the key leaders of that time. So we'll get into all that again next week. I hope you enjoyed this time together. We got a lot more to go when it comes to Reformation. We've only even talked about one guy so far, and there's a bunch to talk about. So we'll jump more into that next week. I hope you have a great week. Thanks for joining me today, and God bless.